pardon the interruption, friends. It is July, and that means CWC Unit 2. I am Amy Poppinga, joined by
Chris Gehrz.
And Sam Mulberry.
Well, here we are. We've made it, friends. And the first exam, I mean, it is in the rear view mirror. But let's take a second and look in that rear view mirror and see what is behind us. And Sam, look out that back window.
Hey, Amy, you just didn't drive down a freeway yesterday, did you? By any chance? Well, what are rear view mirror references already?
As a matter of fact, I did. Sam, what went well? What went well? Give us some advice on what could go better. We all want to improve.
Yeah, I would say that the first thing, as we were doing our little pre-show and talking about the exams a little bit, one of the things I was really impressed with was in the first 3 webisodes, especially the last 2, as we were talking about the exam. I know Amy and I said a lot about managing your time well, getting your resources put together. It's plenty of time, but not if you're not organized. And I think this is the first time in 7 summers of teaching this that everybody that nobody emailed us frantically saying I didn't have time, I didn't get, which is amazing. So you guys did a really good job of that. And I will say, reading the stuff that you wrote, like a lot of you used, I saw really specific details, and that's another thing that we talked about in the last 2 webisodes. So I think sometimes when we get to a test and we're trying to get stuff out, sometimes we speak in generalities, and there were some folks who did that. And I would say go back and read the comments on these things. I tend to write more in the comments, especially for the first test, because I want you to see, like, you don't need to have everything that I'm saying here, but look at all the potential things you could have talked about. So there are some people who need to work on that a little more, but I was impressed by the folks who did use specific things from the readings. So I would say that was something that really impressed me. Chris, did you have any observations?
Yeah, no, that was my sense too. And I would just preface it all by saying, like, the first test is always the hardest test, whether it's summer online, fall face-to-face. Like, a CWC test is not especially natural kind of human activity, and it takes a while to get used to it. And so, like, I mean, I think basically students are doing fine. Like, I mean, 2 things I noticed, like, generally students did really well in the objective sections, which is what we'd hope to see. I mean, where people tended to struggle would be, I had a couple of students maybe not do quite as well in quotation matching. And I think the thing about that is you can always look up the quotations, right? I don't think I'm giving anything away to tell students you have a PDF that's searchable, right? And so you can spend time in the test looking for quotations, but that's kind of a waste of time. I think maybe if you did get like 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10 on that, maybe just think about how are you doing readings, first of all. How are you taking notes on readings? How are you organizing that? Because really the best solution to that is simply keeping up with the readings. And that's one of the reasons, excuse me, it's one of the reasons we do these response papers, is to kind of help you get the main idea. But of course, once in a while you've got, like, it's a museum day, right? And you've got a reading and maybe that person shows up in the museum, but maybe it's not really on the worksheet. You've got to figure out how to kind of keep that in your memory for the test. And the second one, and again, something that shows up on every possible kind of CWC test, is maps. And this is where there's the widest spectrum. Like, for a lot of my students, it was 10 out of 10, very easy, no problem. And then people who struggled really tend to struggle with maps. And so I think the main thing I'd say there is we actually put a lot of maps in the course, not just on like Moodle, but almost anytime you walk into a new section of a museum, there's a map that's meant to help orient you to here's where, like the medieval museum you're about to visit, here's where different monasteries were located, here's where the Crusades took place. And so you don't have to memorize all of that, but if you're not the kind of person who's already pretty familiar with sort of the shape of Europe, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, North Africa, just kind of use that to just get that locked in your head of, okay, here's where France is, here's where Palestine is, here's where North Africa is, here's where Greece is. And then a second tool you can use, since we're in this remote format, one of the things that you have in your Google suite of tools is a map builder, actually. If you just go like the same place you would start a Google Doc or a spreadsheet, you can actually start a map. You can go ahead and create your own review maps if you want. And I would say don't make them too complicated. Like, have something for each of the major cities we visit and just like put vocab terms down. And that's an easy way to just sort of, again, cluster terms in certain spots so you're ready to see them on the test itself.
So you mentioned, Chris, that we are moving into the Middle Ages. When we've been to a museum already, done some readings on the Middle Ages. So I want to think a little bit about that term Middle Ages, and I almost want to put the term middle in quotes, even though that's what we call it. So what might be misleading or dismissive about calling the Middle Ages the Middle Ages?
Right. I mean, so the history of this is that they're obviously not called the Middle Ages when you're in the middle of the Middle Ages. No one has any sense that there's something coming to look forward to, right? They're trying to build a civilization that we're trying to document, especially in the museum you just saw. Middle Ages comes from later. It comes from what's on the other side of this webisode, the Renaissance. What you'll see is some of the Renaissance humanists, the scholars we talk about, are fairly dismissive of the Middle Ages. They feel like what they're actually called to do is to go back before the Middle Ages, to go back to the sources of the Greeks and the Romans, or maybe the early church will be a Reformation kind of theme. And the Middle Ages is just this kind of thing you've got to get through between the golden days of the ancient world and whatever new great thing that we'll eventually call the modern world is coming. And so in that sense, it does feel a little bit awkward to just keep calling it the Middle Ages, right? At the same time, I think what is helpful about that is one theme you should pick up on throughout this part of the unit is the sense of transition. You know, we start with moving from the ancient world into a new kind of civilization. And then we kind of end this part of the unit moving from that civilization into whatever is coming next. And so even though the Middle Ages is very long, about 1,000 years roughly, and it feels very much like, you know, Gothic cathedrals don't suggest movement, but there's actually a lot of transition. And so that sense of being in the middle of something actually is, I think, somewhat important to the Middle Ages. But I think it is important to understand that that's certainly not how medievals themselves felt, was they're in the middle of something that was terrible, that, you know, something better was coming. Amy, throughout his textbook, I think one of the things we like about Bachman's version of Cultures of the West is that he talks about Islam as part of the West. The Muslims are part of this story. So as someone who teaches courses on the history of Islam, is this appropriate? Is Islam part of Western culture during this period we're calling the Middle Ages, like 500 to 1500 or so?
Yes, and again, as you just noted, that's one of the reasons that we actually switched to this Bachman text. So students, this is the only, you know, college level Western Civ text you've seen, but we want you to know that, like, we do think this is like the best, that we intentionally made a choice to switch to this text for its readability, but the way that Bachman structures things. But one of the things that we really liked about it was the fact that Bachman did not sort of make Islam and the development of the Islamic Empire and Islamic civilizations as like a footnote, or even sort of like a, well, you know, in other news, but rather treated it as an integration of cultures. And this is something that I know all of us teach in other classes, this idea that, like, culture is permeable. Cultures don't just bounce off of each other. I always use the analogy of the lava lamp, that instead, like, culture is like blobs, and one blob interacts with another. And then, like, sometimes a new big blob is created, or there's all these little breakoffs. And so to your point about the Middle Ages, first of all, I've never so acutely felt being 42 as that whole conversation that you just had and the way you describe being in the middle. But like, and we're all in our 40s, right? But I was thinking of how from the position of being a scholar of Islam, one of the arguments for not using the term Middle Ages, or at least problematizing the term, is that it is super Eurocentric. It's a Eurocentric term because you're only thinking about that 1,000 years from the perspective of looking back on it in the Western European context. This is not the middle for the Islamic Empire. In fact, it's like the height of Islamic civilization and engagement with, like, scientific inquiry and scientific achievement and expansion and the building of an empire and structuring and solidifying and codifying the world's second largest religion. So what I like about Bachman is it also, it's not the case that there wasn't interaction between the Islamic Empire and European civilization. And we see that example most prominently in looking at Spain in the middle of the 11th and 12th centuries, where there is kind of like a mixing of Islam with Christianity, as well as like with Judaism, but then also like an ethnic and cultural kind of integration, that much of that evidence is still there today. So if somebody travels to Spain, yes, you're in Europe, but you're also seeing the influences architecturally as well as culturally of, a different culture that came into that environment. So I think that that's really important for us to know, because as much as we want to be focused on like, this is the story we're telling, and reminding students of that helps us to, point out that like, you may think certain things are missing, certain things are missing. We're aware of that, but this is kind of a moment where we get to say, okay, but this is a pretty big thing going on over here, but it's not just over there. It's actually kind of like coming in like a wave. It's sort of like, the wave sometimes comes in really strong and retreats. And so we really like Bachman for the ways in which it pays attention to that. So, so the central exhibit in our medieval museum has to do with medieval theology and practice of the sacraments. Sam, as our resident grown-up Catholic, what do 21st century Protestants tend to misunderstand, do you think, about the sacraments?
There's actually a number of things, and I think when I think about how the medievals thought about the sacraments, how medieval Christians thought about it, like, it actually makes me, it warms me to this idea, right? So for the first thing we need to understand about the sacraments is that they are essential channels of God's grace. You receive God's grace through the sacraments. And that doesn't begin in the Middle Ages. Augustine is talking about that when he debates with the Donatists. But I think what we need to understand is, why does grace matter in the Middle Ages? Why we need the sacraments for grace? Why does grace matter? Now, we think about grace, you think, okay, well, we're saved by grace. So grace is about salvation, which it is for medieval people, but for medievals are also going to say grace is also about purification. And this is why a doctrine like purgatory matters, right? Purgatory is, anybody who goes to purgatory when they die is eventually going to get to heaven. It's about purification, and grace helps purify you so that you get to heaven quicker, right? So I think a big piece of this then is that for medieval people, sin really matters. Sin has effects. So when I'm thinking about the sacraments, I'm thinking specifically about penance, and because that's one that I think feels even more distant sometimes for modern Protestants. This idea that you come to the church and you talk to the priest and you confess your sins and you're absolved of these sins and you get this penitential work that you're supposed to do. So medieval people, when they think about why sin matters, they think about it both vertically, which I think all Christians tend to think about, are my relationship to God. Sin damages my relationship to God. So in the sacrament of penance, when I confess my sins, the order really matters here. So I go in, I'm contrite, I confess my sins, and then I'm absolved of my sins, right? The priest tells me, and it's not the priest doing this, it's sort of the priest telling me, remember, God has forgiven you. If you admit your sins, you can confess your sins. God has forgiven you. That vertical relationship is healed. God's grace does that. But then penance isn't about healing that vertical relationship with God. Penance is about, how do we make right the horizontal effects of sin? If I sin, it affects you. It affects the world around me. So penance is about making that right as well, right? So I think for medieval people, sin matters. Sin has consequences. And the sacraments are about, how do we deal with the consequences of sin? That's really what penance is about. And like I said, I think this purification idea is really a huge piece of it. I think we sometimes undersell, maybe as 21st century Protestants, the power of grace. Grace isn't just about like this is your ticket into heaven. Grace is about healing relationships. Grace is about helping to help us live out the gospel, helping to purify the lives that we lead. And I think that's a key idea for medieval sacraments. So what did I get wrong there?
I really like what you said about, I don't know that I've heard you use that language before, of the idea of kind of like horizontal reconciliation. The notion of the sacraments is to help us, if we only think of this in terms of punishment, there's nothing teaching in punishment. There's nothing restorative about punishment, but the idea that, through the sacraments, we're doing a process of restoring and changing and setting ourselves up, hopefully, for not repeating, sort of, quote, the same mistakes, or and so that notion of kind of creating, restoring here at that horizontal level, I think is really useful. And I definitely think, as somebody that did not grow up in the Catholic tradition, and somebody who now really appreciates much of like just liturgy and tradition within Protestantism that I didn't really know growing up. Studying the sacraments and better understanding them is something that I think has been really powerful for me, especially as somebody who studies another religion that has a lot of orthoprax elements, like things that we do to bring us into right relationship with God. So I think it's just like me wanting to say to students, my initial reaction to learning about sacraments was probably pretty dismissive, like, well, that's not what I do. And so I just want to encourage, if that's like a student's first response, like kind of check that and kind of ask what's going on there, and then really kind of dig into looking at what value there is, and really these things that you just said. So I didn't think you missed anything. But.
No, not at all. I would just add the other way to think about it is almost like not just the noun sacrament, but the adjective sacramental. Like it's a certain view of the world. So Amy mentioned that medieval culture is very permeable, right? Especially in kind of borderlands like Spain, where you've got these different religions and ethnic groups interacting with each other. And I think sometimes our image of the Middle Ages is a castle, right? Thick stone walls, something rigid that keeps things apart. But I think there's another permeable boundary in medieval culture between this world and the next, between the natural and the supernatural. And so maybe the best image of the Middle Ages is actually the host. It's the piece of bread that is still bread. It's still earthly. It's the most basic food stuff in European culture. But it also is the body of Christ at the same time. And I think that's just a symbol of a very common medieval idea that God is found everywhere in the world, even though he's distinct from the world. And so medievals fully expect God to be working in just ordinary things. And the sacraments point to that, not just food, like bread and wine, or water and baptism, but like work, family, death itself. I mean, that's what the sacraments are all about, growing up. I mean, it's the sacrament of confirmation, that God is active in those very mundane, earthly kind of activities.
I think that's something that's really powerful, just because I do think that in contemporary Christian culture, in America as well as in other places, but we tend to, just sort of segment God into parts of our day or parts of our identity. It's sort of, again, it's like this fixed idea of like, well, God is present when I'm at church. God is present when I'm at camp. God is present when I choose to do a devotion, or I choose to pray, or I choose to think about God. That's like when God gets activated. He's at like a like an animated thing at Chuck E. Cheese or something, which is gone bankrupt, I just learned. But I think that is what is so powerful about thinking about the Middle Ages, is really pushing ourselves to get into this mindset of like God is ever present, and that was not something that that was something that was communally shared. That doesn't mean, as we see people doing awful things, so it does not mean people did not either choose to not be convicted by that or take that to heart. But it's such an interesting thing to study a culture where collectively that idea of God's presence in everything is just widely accepted. And I guess that kind of helps us even understand, right, this commitment to building something like a cathedral that was literally going to be a lifetime commitment. I mean, if you look at life expectancy, and you think that you could very well be working on this in some respect and full well know you're not going to be alive to see it be finished. But it just, to me, is an embodiment of the mentality of, just God's ever presence. But
absolutely. And the sacraments are such a core thing for understanding why the church was so central in the Middle Ages. Another big pillar of, to use the parlance of the films that we've watched, of medieval habitation, another huge pillar of that is this idea of Christendom. And this is a concept that it's perhaps the word students hadn't heard before. It's perhaps a concept students hadn't necessarily encountered before. Chris, can you talk about what Christendom is, and is it something that exists anymore? I mean, if we look at the modern world, do we see even remnants of Christendom?
Right. So Christendom is just a contraction. It just means Christ's kingdom, right? And so I think one way to think about this is, what do we mean what does it mean when we come to the New Testament and read something where Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God, or the reign of God, or the kingdom of heaven? What is kingdom exactly? And my guess is the New Testament authors, when they're writing that, it's something imminent, right? It's something that's happening very soon, right? They expect Christ will return and fully establish his kingdom. It's here, but it's not yet here, and it's coming soon. But time goes on, and that hasn't happened. We get to the end of Unit 1, and by the time we get to Augustine, it's been 400 years since the death and resurrection of Christ. And do we have the kingdom of Christ? Is he returned in some sense? Well, we have another kingdom. We've got the Roman Empire, and now that's run by Christians. And so Augustine in City of God is wrestling, well, should we be part of that in some way? And so a different way of thinking about the kingdom of God or the reign of God is, well, can we establish that here on earth in some way? Maybe our job is not to wait for that to just come. Maybe we're not just passive spectators expecting that to arrive. Maybe our job is to build that somehow. And so it makes some sense as you enter the Middle Ages, when things are falling apart, you're going to be rebuilding things. And maybe now it's the time to build the kingdom of God. And so I think what medievals mean when they talk about Christendom is some sense that they're building a thoroughly, pervasively Christian society. And it doesn't just mean that the church is powerful and important and that people take the sacraments, although that's at the center of everything. It means that there are other separate institutions. The state is separate from church in the medieval West. I mean, there are different leaders, different roles, different nature, but the state is also pervasively Christian. Its leaders are meant to be Christian. Its laws are meant to be shaped by scripture, by Christian ethics, by the teachings of the church. Its educational system, its healthcare system, family life. That's why marriage is so important as a sacrament. So everything is shaped by Christianity. So that's a medieval way of thinking about Christendom. Getting ahead of ourselves in the story, like that will go away through the Reformation, through wars of religion, through the secularization of the Enlightenment. And by the time we get to the American history, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? We've pretty long had a pretty significant sense of separating church and state in this country. And by the 1820s, at least, there aren't any more established churches. The state is not supporting churches anymore. At the same time, there is still this sense that this is a Christian nation, right? And that Christianity ought to shape its laws and its political behavior and maybe its economic behavior and its healthcare system. And that idea is still there. In some respects, that's a pretty attractive idea, to think that we should not be segmenting, here's our religious life over here, and then here's our political, economic, educational, family life over here. I mean, shouldn't those influence each other? Shouldn't, in Martin Luther King's language, the church be a thermostat, adjusting the values of this world? I think the trick here, and what makes this, I think, problematic from my point of view, is for King, the way that happened is through a certain kind of power, which was the power of an early church that was being persecuted by political authorities, a church that was in the minority, that was on the margins. That was the kind of power of the church. It was not going to happen because Christians would take the reins of power and impose their will on society. And the final thing I'll just say here, because I know you two probably have things to say here too, is the other problem with Christendom is not everyone is a Christian under the command of this supposedly Christian kingdom. You've got a Jewish minority, you've got a Muslim minority, you've got other people who in their heart of hearts are not really Christian, right? And often those religious minorities end up brutalized by this. I mean, especially, we've talked a little bit about the Muslim story, but we should say something about the Jewish story here. Like, it's a very tenuous, dangerous existence to be a Jew in Christendom in the Middle Ages. You're often being scapegoated, you're being exploited, you're often being pushed out of kingdoms and then welcomed back in. And this will not go away from the Western Christian story, right? And so we should think about that. If there is still kind of a sense of Christendom, like if you're an American Christian, do you assume that to be a true American, you've got to be a Christian? That's a kind of legacy of Christendom we should be wary of too.
Yeah, I could not agree more. The concerns with what we in our discipline call like revisionist history is painting with these broad strokes. And so I was thinking, as you were saying, these dangers of if we sort of idealize and hold up Christendom, we are ignoring and overlooking those who were not a part of that and those that were hurt by that. And something I think comes up in teaching 20th century history is that when we arrive at thinking about the state of the Jewish population in Germany leading up to World War II, I think there's kind of this common misconception that that was like some kind of isolated incidents. Like, oh, life was great for Jews everywhere except right there. Oh, no, 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 right? This is life does not get better for the Jewish community throughout Europe. That doesn't mean that there aren't, I mean, like personal advances or economic advance. But the point is the idea that certain groups that are not the religious majority experience difficulty and oppression all throughout the medieval period moving forward. And then when we translate that to our own culture, I do get really worried about the way that we talk about America's early history and what we mean by the notion of a Christian nation, acting as if there was some kind of homogeneity of all people being as one and all people being united in religious belief. And it's just not true. So I'm not saying that to try to be controversial, but again, that kind of overgeneralization is really dangerous.
And I mean, another danger is that when you start to buy into the story too much, it changes then how you respond to the kind of complications of your nation's story. Like if your conviction is, oh, this is a thoroughly Christian society, how then do we answer for the experience of slavery and racism? How do we answer for the injustices that are just woven into the American story? Do you just deny them then because that can't coexist with a Christian nation? Do you maybe better, you repent of them? But I think it tempts you to want to then dismiss those stories and say, well, that can't happen in a truly Christian nation. Well, maybe it should make you ask if it's truly a Christian nation after all.
That is segment one. That is well, we will be right back where we get to watch Chris and Sam engage in a I don't know, an informative display of what we call heads on sticks. We'll be right back.
Welcome back, Chris. We're going to play a little heads on sticks. We're going to take on the personas of some medieval figures and see what they have to say and what they have to teach us. I'll go first, Chris. Who am I?
Sam, looks like you are Hildegard of Bingen. Very fetching garb that you're in today. What is your amazing life? And it really is amazing, thinking about all the things you did and experienced. What is your amazing life? Tell us about the role of women in the Middle Ages.
Well, I think the thing that we need to think about with the Middle Ages, to start with, as we're thinking about the role of women, is that the Middle Ages is, for the most part, a world without mobility. And what I mean by that is there's not social mobility, there's not political mobility, there's not much economic mobility in lots and lots of ways. I mean, there really is this sense that, there's this great chain of being and there's hierarchies and they're constructed by God and you're sort of born into your place. Now, there are some places that have some exceptions. And the world that I lived in is one of those. So I was in a convent, I was a monastic. And I rose to a level where I actually became a person of really great influence, in part because of if I may be boastful, the power of my intellect, my creativity, but also the fact that I was chosen by God. I was chosen by God to be a conduit of some of these mystical experiences, to not just have them, but I was also commanded eventually to write about them. So my life shows that although if we look at the Middle Ages, it's not really a place where, notice we haven't talked about a lot of medieval women. They're not necessarily, women are not people who have prominent positions necessarily economically or politically or things like that. But within the church, there are very few exceptions, but there are exceptions where people like me can rise to a level where I am somebody who's looked upon by some of the people at the very tops of religious, political, social hierarchies. So kings, bishops, even popes came to me to seek guidance and seek advice. So my life points to the exceptions in some way, the exceptions to these rules about mobility, because I'm somebody who, again, because of some unique circumstances, actually rose up from a level different from the one to which I was born.
All right, very well put. Sam, who am I?
You are Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the greatest intellect, the greatest mind of the Middle Ages. So you're a scholastic. So if you can drop a little scholasticism on us, Tom, how would you advise American Christians respond to something like COVID-19?
Well, no, I'm just a 13th century scholastic. I don't know anything about your fancy germ theory or epidemiology or anything, but I think I have two words of advice here. And I think they go back to what I wrote in the Summa Theologica about law, which is that there's this thing called eternal law, which is like reading God's mind, which we can't do. We're just humans. Even someone as brilliant as me can't understand God's law. And so God then reveals himself in two different ways. First, through what I call natural law, which is the eternal law accessible to the rational creature. It's what of God we can understand by reason. And so my first word of advice is be reasonable. I wish I had science back in my day like you guys do, but you've got epidemiologists, you've got public health scholars, you've got physicians who are well trained. You should not discount that just because you are a Christian who believes there's more than just reason and science. You should listen to science. It actually tells you a great deal of what is true and how to behave. But I'd also add that there's more than just reason. And at a certain point, reason does not tell us everything about God's law. And so there's something called the divine law, which we understand through faith. And so I would have you be attentive to the life of not just the mind, but the life of the spirit. And have you think about the role of the church. I'm also a medieval Catholic who believes very strongly in the power of the sacraments and the role of the church in Christendom. And so I would have you think about that side of your life as well, and think about participating in the life of the church, whatever that might look like under COVID for you guys right now. And so I guess I'm telling you to seek a kind of balance or synthesis. That you should be people of reason, but also people of faith, even in the midst of a catastrophe like this pandemic that you're all dealing with right now.
All right, Chris, who am I?
Hey, speaking of pandemics, you are the bubonic plague. Yeah, do you have a cousin called Coronavirus? I feel like we saw someone who looked like you. It wasn't quite.
I'm familiar with his work.
Right. Now, bubonic plague, people blame you for ending the Middle Ages. Fair or unfair?
First off, call me Yersinia pestis. That's
that's right.
That's the name I like to go by. Bubonic plague, Black Death. I mean, these are nicknames, but you're not that familiar with me, so I think we should have a little bit of distance from us. So, did I bring the Middle Ages to an end? Well, I think there's a degree to which that's unfair. Because I think the Middle Age, there's lots of things that were happening in the late medieval period that were bringing the Middle Ages to an end. Now, I definitely accelerated things because I was a major crisis, and I was a major crisis that people at the time couldn't have seen coming. I mean, within 2 or 3 years, huge chunks of the European population and huge chunks of the global population were wiped out because of me. And it's not just the death. I think sometimes people look at me and they look at me and they say, wow, look at all the death you brought about. But what you have to realize is with that comes the necessity for change. And this is where that acceleration comes from. So, if we see a huge death tolls, especially among the peasants in society, that changes the economic relationships between the peasants and the nobility, between the landowners and the people living on the land and working the land. I mean, this is your basic law of supply and demand. If you have a lot of people to work the land, they're not that valuable. Once that number goes down and there's fewer people to work the land, they have more economic value. And there's an opportunity to renegotiate that relationship. So I think to that degree, I kind of helped to, like I said, accelerate that change. But I do think in lots and lots of ways, those changes were coming. I mean, the 14th century is a century of crisis, and the Black Death, is just one of them. But there's lots of other things going on. But I think we see a rapid decline in the Middle Ages because of accelerants like me.
You're very modest for a microbe. I don't know what to say. Okay, Sam, who am I?
You are Sir Gawain.
Hey.
So you look oddly familiar.
Mm-hmm.
How excited are you that somebody who looks exactly like you, the actor Dev Patel, is playing you in the new Green Knight movie, if it ever is able to come out in theaters?
Right. Well, I gotta say, I'm flattered. I'm a big fan of Dev Patel. I remember going to the AMC Camelot to watch Slumdog when it came out, and I've followed his career ever since. So I was pretty happy to see that he was cast as me as Sir Gawain. I think it's a pretty appropriate casting. Like Dev Patel, I think, can play a kind of character who seems awfully virtuous. You know, an embodiment of the Christian warrior in an age of just war, someone who is not just good with the sword and shield, but is virtuous and merciful and pure, right? I think he has that kind of vibe to him. But there's also something there too. Like he's not totally pure. There's maybe he's going to fall a little bit short, like I did in my interaction with the Green Knight, because I did love my life just a little too much, and I was kind of embarrassed, and so I did try to protect my honor, and I had to do penance for that. But the other thing I like about this is, Dev Patel is an English actor. He was born in London, not too far from Camelot. But his parents were South Asian immigrants who actually grown up in Kenya, I believe. And that speaks to something I think, the medievals who wrote my story would really get, the sort of blending and synthesis of different cultures, that the West is not just this one kind of fixed point that has just rigid borders, but it's permeable borders. And I've talked about it in the webisode already. And it's about cultures coming together to create something new. And so this seems like a good 21st century version of an old 14th or 6th century European theme.
Another thing about Dev, he's got great hair.
He does have great hair, right?
Yeah.
Too bad he has to wear a helmet over it. Or maybe
that's right. Although the hair, if you've seen pictures, the hair comes out.
Spills out luxurious.
Yeah. It's very nice. So Chris, do we have a Flipgrid assignment for the students?
Yeah. So as usual, we like to we're kind of halfway through the unit now, but let's look back in the Middle Ages. And what we would like you to do by tomorrow at 10 o'clock, our usual deadline time, is to share with us 2 lessons that you can learn from the people of the Middle Ages. What are 2 things that you can learn? So not necessarily. Sometimes we'll ask you, like, what can 21st century American Christians learn? And you're, I think, a 21st century American Christian, but maybe personalize this a little bit more. And so you can take this in a lot of directions. Like, Sam, can I ask you, what would be one thing that you might talk about if you were doing a Flipgrid video?
Man, I would go back to segment 1 where we talked about sort of how the medievals thought about the nature of sin and grace. I mean, I think you don't have to adopt a sacramental understanding of grace to think about, that sin has ramifications in this world and that sin matters. I mean, that's something, the more I've taught this course and taught about the Middle Ages, that's something that I keep coming back to in my own life.
Yeah, I actually like what Thomas Aquinas just said and does say. Like, I'm not necessarily a Thomistic philosopher myself, but I think we tend to, as moderns, want to dismiss the medievals as ignorant and backwards and superstitious. And if you're going to do that, you have to deal with someone like Thomas Aquinas and the larger scholastic tradition. Like, these are rigorous thinkers who view what they're doing in philosophy and theology as an act of worship. And I think that's something anyone at a school like Bethel ought to be thinking about. I mean, students, do you view what you're doing as an act of worship, or is it just a means to a job? Right? Like that's the latter is a very American 21st century thing to do. What if you thought about your work as a student the way that Thomas Aquinas would have you think about it? That might be something to reflect on. So however you want to take that, and hopefully this kind of clicks with things you're thinking about in your life right now. We just want to hear 2 lessons you think you can learn from the Middle Ages. And
I would say 2 things as you do the Flipgrid to think about. Go ahead and listen to what other people have to say. It was really fun in the last one to listen to what other folks said, although I didn't notice a lot of views between people in the group. So go in and listen to what other people say. And I will say I had some folks who were maybe on a little bit of the shorter end. And I think listening to what other people have to say helps you understand, like, oh, there is more that I can talk about here. So, I think those 2 things will help make your Flipgrids even stronger.
Yeah. So kind of like with the last one, we're actually looking at maybe 5 to 6 minutes, and it might actually be easier to do it. Last time, it might have felt a little bit like you're just kind of repeating a museum answer kind of question. There should be a little bit more personal, a little bit more contemplative and reflective, and maybe it gives you a chance to pull on a few different threads and put some pieces together. So just do that at your small groups Flipgrid site by Thursday, July 9th at 10 o'clock. Okay, we'll be back to wrap things up in just a second. All right, welcome back, everyone, to our last segment. This is Happy Time, starting with happy birthday to Kevin Bacon, I'm going to say it literally unbelievable, 62 years old today. Kevin Bacon is
Wow.
62.
Oh my gosh, not feeling so bad about being middle-aged now.
That's right. Sam, how many degrees separate you from Kevin Bacon?
I think the shortest route I can take is 4.
That's amazing.
In 4 moves. So I worked on a short-lived, defunct animation project with a woman named Nancy Hersage, who's my aunt, around the year 2000. She also, in 1996, wrote a made-for-TV movie starring Kerry Russell, who was in Mission Impossible 3 with Tom Cruise, who was in A Few Good Men with Kevin Bacon. So that's me to Kevin Bacon in 4 moves.
I love that because of that, there's like 400 of us that are 5 degrees.
That's right.
Right.
Absolutely. Happy birthday to the Roswell
Happy
USO.
anniversary, I think.
Happy anniversary. And I also said USO. Happy anniversary to the Roswell UFO incident. On this date in 1947, Roswell Army Airfield released a statement stating that the military had recovered a mysterious flying disc. Amy, as a native New Mexican, what are your feelings about Roswell?
Well, there is the extremely popular Roswell TV series. I always think of Dr. Dan Yim, who holds up Roswell, and then like Firefly is like 2 of his like all-time favorite series. But as a native New Mexican, New Mexico first. So of course I am going to choose the city of Roswell. And in New Mexico in general, there is just a lot of UFO shtick woven into like the entire state. When your state is only famous for so few things, you've really got to embrace like whatever you've got going. And so I always grew up with like a lot of like, like coffee shops with like clever names around, like UFO type culture. And I even remember when I moved to Minnesota, one of the things was like, nobody here care about space. Like, what's the deal? What's the problem? And students, you will recall, I already apologized to NASA for those jokes we made about NASA in a previous webisode. But I would love to say, make sure that you visit Roswell, but I got to tell you, it's okay if you miss it. It's totally all right. I can think of other places in New Mexico that I would prefer to send you to maybe learn about like Billy the Kid, another one of our big claims to fame. So,
you're really selling New Mexico hard right now.
Yeah, I know. But I just want to say happy anniversary to Roswell. Yes, Sam, just clear it up. Not the birthday. We have completely different celebrations and ways of honoring the birthday of Roswell. But it's an important and special day for Roswell and for me and my family. So our celebrations look different this year because of the global pandemic, but I really hope to see everybody again next year in Roswell on July 1st. So.
Well, you really ran with that one.
That's pretty great. But to step from my culture to somebody else's culture, happy trails to Swedish military power. On this day in 1709, the Russian Tsar Peter the Great crushed the Swedish army at the Battle of Poltava, ending Sweden's brief reign as a European great power. Chris, listen carefully. In 25 words or less, what's it like being Swedish?
I think I can use 20 words just to explain that it will not take 25 words.
Okay.
The answer to this question is, it's fine. It's fine.
Which also means I love you. I'm so sorry.
I'm miserable. How dare you talk to me?
But it's good that he didn't say it's interesting, right? That would be worse.
If I were in a worse mood, it'd be interesting.
What's interesting is code for likely we're all going to die.
That's right. But in picking up on last webisode, it's fine also means I hate the humidity in Minnesota right now. But I'm not going to complain about it.
Well, next year in Roswell, friends. Try heat.
Okay, well, I think we hit the ground running for Unit 2. This is a pretty good webisode. As always, students, you can email us. Sam, what's your email address again?
s-mulberry@bethel.edu.
So you can let us know. Like we try to do our best to kind of think about what questions you might have after you've gone through some readings in museum, but maybe there's something else. And if you have a question about it, chances are there are at least 5 other students who have the same question. So let us know and we'll put that into the script. Remember that you do have a Flipgrid assignment to do before tomorrow at 10 o'clock. What are 2 lessons you can learn from the people of the Middle Ages. So we've tried to give you a few ideas, especially in the first segment, but maybe you've picked up something else from a reading or a museum room or anything else you've already visited. You're halfway through Unit 2. Test is coming up before too long. That was the bad news. I tried to bury that lead. Okay, any final thoughts, you two?
It's fine.
Okay. Well, I think for Amy and Sam, I'll call an end to this webisode. We'll see you next time. Until then, say goodnight, Stacy.